Right. Hello and welcome to lesson 4 of our series. Welcome again. So we're obviously we're doing music. We've been looking at musical instruments and repeating instruments. Last week we had a discussion about Picasso and his use of collage and different analytical cubist shapes and things like that. And we also picked up on a little bit of Poole and an artist called Sue Clark. Sue Clark's, I think it was Sue Clark. Yeah. So we've been looking at that work, and then we looked at how to create a composition using photographs, either drawing freehand or with tracing paper last week as well. And we spent a bit of time shading those in preparation for doing a painting. So I've got a new artist to show you today that is quite similar in many ways, but has one particular feature about his work that is interesting that we could use, which I'm using on the painting that I've started. So I'm going to be talking about creating a background, first of all, using tracing paper off of your drawing to then translate that into a painting. So we'll go over to the other, oh gosh, I keep getting flies. I keep getting flies around here because I leave the garage door open and in they come. Right, anyway, here we go. Right, so the artist in the middle here is known as Kieth Mallet. Is an artist that I found recently. So I'll talk about that in a second. But you can see the work we've looked at previously on here. So we've got Susan Clark, who overlaps these different musical instruments, but also uses strong contrasting colours and some harmonies in there as well to make different parts of the musical instrument pop out from the background, but whilst creating a sense of atmosphere. And down the bottom there, you can see the repeating shapes that Poole used to give us a sense of rhythm and music in an abstract form. And then in the top, just under my name, you can also see the trumpet that we were working on before. And some of you might still be working on that. So keep going and you'll have plenty of time to get to the next bit. And next to that, of course, is the Picasso style cubist looking sculpture of the multiple musical instruments. And then the Picasso on the other side of Kieth Mallet, just over there. So I've got quite a few. Now, the reason I've picked up on this artist today is mainly because he uses these really nice colours, but you can see that there's a yellow area. It's almost like a spotlight is falling down across the musician here, which I thought was really atmospheric and lends a lot of ideas to us, really, for the work we're going to be doing. So Kieth Mallet was, or is, he creates these really vibrant and expressive paintings that often depict themes from his culture, from his African heritage, some spirituality in there as well, and his cultural identity. And it often creates a sense of movement and emotion and captures the essence of his subjects. So I've got a few more here, actually. So I'll try and pop those on screen as well. So there's another one there, another one. I think I've got another one over there. So I've got a few here to give us an idea of what his work is like. And again, a lot of these pictures, and he does a lot of variety in his work. A lot of these pictures have got these beautiful, rich colours and atmosphere in them as well, haven't they? So he began his work in around the 1980s, actually, working professionally. And he got a lot of recognition for doing these pieces of work based on his African-American life and culture. And he's done a diverse amount of things. He's worked for galleries and museums, private collections around the world as well. And he showcased his showcases his versatility and talent. an artist. So the main techniques that he uses, which is good because we use acrylic, he used a lot of acrylics in his work, and obviously these nice bold and vibrant colours with richness and depth in there as well, which is what we're going to have a go at next with our work. And he also puts a lot of texture into his stuff as well, and facial expressions too, and uses symbolism within his work often. And you can see actually there's some words in there, which reminds me of what Picasso might have done. He added some words into his stuff as well, didn't he? He's also explored, as you can see from this, the world of music and art as well. And this reflects themes of emotions conveyed in the music itself, and often captures the energy of jazz and performance, or evoking the soulful melodies of like gospel song and things as well. So I think the colours are really kind of atmospheric within his work here, particularly the one that I first brought up, and maybe the one with the cello and the saxophone, maybe all of them actually. But we've got these lovely yellows in the middle, and then the blues on the outside with a slightly different tone to them, or tint to them. So so we're going to have a look at some of this. What I'm doing is I'm taking the drawing that we did last week, and I'm going to, or I have started this already, to be honest, but I've drawn a couple of lines to show this idea of a spotlight. Obviously, we haven't got people in the ones we're doing at the moment, but this could be something we work towards in the next lessons as well, using people within the pictures too. So I'll take you over to here, to the screen. So this is obviously the trumpets that we did with the shapes repeated in the background. So we kind of started to touch on a bit of abstraction. And we've touched on watercolors and using wax crayons in there as well. And this was some of the stuff that we did last week. So taking different instruments, you could trace them or just draw them freehand if you wanted to, in order to create these effects. But the nice, interesting thing that you can also do if one object is behind the other is you can make it so the objects are a little bit maybe transparent, but you can get the flow of the objects going through each other like that. And this is the one that I did in lesson last time. So you've got a guitar, cello, and this French horn sort of flowing around there. And you've got little bits of the frets from the cello just here, and these buttons from the French horn kind of overlapping and interacting with each other. And one thing to sort of think about, if you're still working on this, is I started, I think, from memory, I started by shading the background quite heavily, because those negative shapes help to start figuring out where all the different elements are within the picture. So like this is how it would have looked originally, or something like that, but a bit more sketchy. So there's obviously a lot of shapes in there, but once you start shading in some of the negative areas, it starts to pick out those details and help you to figure out what you'd like to do with it. All right. So anyway, so what I've done essentially is I've traced the outline, as you can see from here. And then in order to get it the right way around again, I've gone over the back and then traced the outline onto a sheet of paper, which I've pre-prepared with the background. So I thought it'd be interesting this time, because we often just put a colour down on the surface and then start working over it. So I've done a blended background this time. So a blend like this. So I've taken just two colours, harmonious colours. So they're colours that are quite closely related or next to each other on the colour wheel. So I've got this green and blue, which I've blended together. I did do a tracing on here, but I did two, so this was a demo one today. So I'll show you what I've done. So just move that around a bit. So you can see how I've taken inspiration from Kieth Mallet, just over here in his is like it's almost like a spotlight coming through the figure. So I've done that with this here. So using the drawing as well, in order to know where I want to go dark and light. So in other words, it's a bit like a no-tan that we did in the last series of lessons. So the darks and lights are on here. It gives me an idea of how I'm going to then work into this. I'm using a colour palette, which is going to be browns and yellows and a bit of blue, perhaps in this area. And then I'm going to swap it out and do a different colour scheme at the sides so that they contrast. So it'd probably be some oranges and reds and things on the outside of this, if you want to call it a spotlight in there. Okay, so I'll do I will do a little background to show you how I did that, because often people do ask me, how do you do the blending with acrylics? With a larger area, obviously you're going to need a different brush, really, aren't you? So I've got this size brush. You can use bigger ones if you want. I quite like this filbert brush here. And one of the things I would say is to use plenty of water when you're doing a larger area with acrylic. And you can go over it again, of course, like you always can with acrylic. Quite wet look. And then that allows the area to stay wet enough for you to be able to blend it. Because once acrylic is dry, there's not a great deal you can do with it. If it's a bit damp, you can usually work it. So there's my green, and then I'll quickly go over, wet up some blue. Plenty of water on there. And then start a little bit further away and go over that area. Obviously, I'm not covering the whole sheet of paper here. You start away from where you just finished and then go and blend into it. So if it's looking a bit streaky, then lift the brush so just the bristles are just sort of touching the surface rather than doing it too heavily. And basically just keep going until you get exactly what you're looking for with your blend. So you can see I'm just going over it because I'll make that green a little bit darker. And then I'll get my blue again. So I'm just dipping that in some water over there. I'm not taking lots of time to clean the brushes off perfectly. So there's a bit more blue. And then whilst that's drying, the thing to do is to prepare your tracing. Obviously there was already a tracing on here, but what I did on the one I just showed you is I traced it on afterwards and then went over it, so it's quite clear, so I could see it very clearly when I was painting it. Okay, so that's, if you can see that, it's a bit shiny, but a very simple blend. I could do that a little bit more just there because it's a bit streaky, but if I just keep doing it quite gently and lightly, you can get rid of most of the streaks. And as the paint dries a little bit, those streaks will start to disappear a little bit. So it's important to brush over a few times to help with that. That's starting to dry a little bit, and it won't take long to be ready to trace on top of once you've got your outlines sorted. There, that's a bit better. Okay, so I'll put that over there. So I used that piece of tracing paper that I had earlier. I'll just put down, and I once I've done over the back, then put it down, went over it. Now, if you find that your drawing is a little bit bigger, I did actually position this at an angle on the original drawing so that I could get in as much as I could on my paper. So I sort of I moved it to the side like that. And then this bit I just sketched in because it wasn't major. I could just draw that in really quickly. But it meant I've got the outlines from this ready to start painting into. All right. Now, the other little thing with acrylics, and I find this really relaxing, enjoyable, is to work on just a small area at a time. So try not to work big unless you just want to fill a large area. I've been working on a smaller area a little bit at a time in order to do the blending. Because as I was just saying, the acrylic, as you know, the acrylic will dry quite quickly. So it's quite nice to do the blending and the layering as you progress across the picture. Takes a bit more time like that, but it works quite well, I think. There we go. So what I've got in here is a bit of brown, which was probably the burnt umber. I've also got some crimson, I think, red. I've got some cadmium yellow and white. So if I wanted the colour to be more opaque, I would add a little bit of titanium white. But some colours, such as yellow ochre, are quite opaque anyway. So they're not, you can layer those up quite nicely without having to add white. But some colours you definitely need to. And you'll find that particularly with a cadmium yellow and acrylic, you need to add a bit of white to it. And that will help it to sit on the surface and things and lift the colours out. So this area, I didn't use any white, just use paint without any white to lift it up. But this area, I was using more white and yellow ochre, make it pop a little bit more out of the picture. So what I'll do is I'll literally, I think, unless I get fed up and want to do something else, I'm going to work all the way down here first. So I've got that shard or that spotlight that I wanted, and then I'll go out here like that and do these sides in different colours, or reds and warmer colours, I think, and purples perhaps as well to create the atmosphere. Okay, so that's what we're going to do tonight. If you've not finished the stuff from before, please make sure you do. Or if you're really fed up with it and you want to move on, that's absolutely fine. Or you just feel like you need a break, move on to the next thing. But this will take us probably the next couple of weeks at least to paint. It should do. Anyway, I'm working on A3 size paper here. If you're working on a smaller one, it may take you less time, but it's quite a nice size to work A3 because it's big enough for you to get your brushes in there and play around with the colours and things. All right. So, would anyone like to ask me a question? Everybody all right? Right. So, the main purpose of this lesson for me on this painting was to paint down the middle section. So the middle section is, as I may have mentioned a minute ago, the area where I've kind of got a little bit of a spotlight thing going on through the middle. So mainly in this case, I'm going to be using mainly yellows and a few browns and things like that. So as I progress down here, you'll see that I start to perhaps introduce more whites and yellows to make the whole thing a little bit lighter in the middle. And it might be that when I paint the other areas on the outside that I decide I need to do that more. But for the time being, I'm just gradually building up the colours on here. Now, I can't remember if I mentioned this either, but I'll just say it again anyway. So the background area, you can see just below my hand there, I didn't use any white paint at all, which is something I suggest sometimes if you want your colour to be a bit opaque over a slightly darker background. So I didn't do that, but I used a bit of blue, a bit of brown, and some yellow. The yellow being particularly light in colour, or sorry, translucent when you apply it. So with the guitar and everything else you can see on here, I've been adding a little bit of white to the paint. Now that allows for the paint to become more opaque, particularly titanium white, not mixing white, titanium white. If you mix that with a colour, it's going to sit on the surface of that blue background and lift the colours out of there. Whereas without the white, you get a lot of the blue coming through the colour. You'll still get that to a degree, even with white, but it does work quite nicely. Now, I've still got the video speeded up, but I've slowed it down to what I normally do. So you can just see how I paint some of these details here. So yes, it is speeded up, but so with regards to blending and things, because a lot of people always say, how do you blend acrylic paints? And the problem often is that the paint will, with acrylic, it will dry unless you use something like a retardant medium, which slows the drying process down considerably. Or you can actually buy some paints that are designed, acrylic paints that are designed to stay wet for longer as well. These are just ordinary acrylic paints that I'm using. So the best way, if you're doing detailed work like this and you want to blend, the best thing to do is, I've found, is to work on one area at a time. So whilst the paint is a little bit damp, so this is where you just need to add a little bit of water to the paint to keep it wet for longer, obviously. But then try to do the blending that you want to do whilst you're in that area of the picture. So here you can see me, I'm putting down some yellow paint on here, and occasionally I'm dipping into the water up there on the top. Now, when you're blending as well, what I've also found is that if you just keep your brush damp, not wet, so it's dripping, but just a bit damp, then you'll find it easier to do your blending and so forth as well. So a damp brush will allow you not to pick up the paint, the sort of tacky paint from the surface, but it allows you to move the paint around so that you can blend it like I'm doing just here now. So a damp brush as opposed to a soggy wet brush. If you put a soggy wet brush on here, what it'll do when you start brushing is it'll just lift the paint off and remove it, because it goes kind of tacky when it dries, because it's kind of a plasticky paint or resin-based paint, or whatever you want to call it. But if it's tacky like that, it'll just it'll come off in clumps when you sort of start brushing with a brush that's too wet. So just slightly damp. What I tend to do is dip my brush into the water like that and mix the paint so it flows a bit better. But when I'm just using a damp brush, what I'll do is I'll dip it in the water and then just dampen it off with a little bit of a paper towel or a bit of tissue or a cloth or something like that. And what that does is it just means that it's definitely not going to be drippy, but it is going to be damp enough for you to be able to move the paint around and things. So try it out, see how you get on with that. And I think you'll find it works. It works quite well. And so just work on one little area at a time, and you should have some success with that. And once you get into the flow, it's really quite enjoyable, I find. Once you start relaxing and just enjoying playing with the colours, it works out quite well. And this is quite nice for me this evening as well on this, because what I'm finding is that I'm limiting my colors, the colors that I'm using in this area. So I'm just focusing on one area at a time, and I'm quite enjoying just, using those limited colors and mixing and blending different areas. And don't forget, I'm referring back to the original drawing that I did, that you saw me do in the last lesson. So go back and watch that if you haven't seen it. And that just gives you an idea of where you're going to go and shade light and dark. Or if your pencil drawing wasn't quite right, you could adjust that, or you could adjust how you apply the colors. So this is, a limited, as I said, a bit of a limited color palette on here, which just allows you to get into the flow and enjoy things as well. And don't forget, the nice thing about acrylics is that you can work into them. You can paint into areas, and then you might decide, I'm not so sure I like that, and you can paint back over it without too much trouble at all. Obviously, if you've got a dark color, you might need a bit of white with your color so that it literally paints over. But it's quite forgiving from that point of view. The only drawback I would say is that it dries quickly, and once it's dry, it's dry. It'll stay dry. So unlike gouache or other materials like that, once you've painted it, you can't change it. So you paint over it, basically. But I've always found it a really nice medium to use. And in fact, the artist that we can see up there with the jazz picture, Kieth Mallet, he uses acrylics too. As did Suzanne, what was her name? Suzanne, I can't remember her second name now, but Suzanne, the other artist we've been looking at, she also uses acrylics. So there you go. Good fun. And one colour that is quite useful on this bit of painting was yellow ochre. So yellow ochre has quite a opacity to it as well. So that's a nice colour to use in this area as well. So you just saw me around the part of the guitar that looks like a musical note. I don't know what it's called. Just around there, I've added, on top of the color that I applied a minute ago, I've added highlights. So I can decide to really push some areas, add highlights to them, and draw attention to them. And I do that a little bit more at the top of the guitar a bit later on as well. So I've added a little bit more of a red sort of color in here too. Again, you can draw attention to certain areas, not just with highlights and shadows, but with also a bit more of a zingy color. Although I wouldn't call that zingy, it's more of a warmer brown. There we go, a little bit of white just there. And a little bit of more of a reddish color. And then at the top of the guitar, I've just drawn a bit more attention to that as well. So it's fantastic. It's really good fun painting that this evening. And you'll see me in a second doing the little buttons from the French horn as well. So we've linked in all of this work with these artists, and also it kind of comes together with Picasso as well, and his analytical cubism, overlapping different shapes, creating abstraction. And the nice thing about creating abstraction in this case is that we can really just enjoy painting and looking at shapes and practicing the variation in tone and shadow and blending and things like that. So it's great practice, really. And as I mentioned before, I may go back in and add even more highlights, or really push the idea that it's a spotlight. It's not going to look particularly like a spotlight in this case, I think, unless I do something more with the background or some different areas of the image. But the idea will be similar. You've got this cutting through of these lovely yellows. And then the sides I'm probably going to do either in reds or in blues and purples, which I think I probably will actually. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. And so we'll be doing this one next week. And then in the future lessons, I think we'll be moving towards painting people with instruments as well, using photographs as references and some of the ideas that we've been looking at. So one of the big things about doing these paintings was decision making, deciding where different colours go. I mean, you have a plan, of course, but when it comes down to painting and how you paint it, there's lots of decisions. There's decisions about where you place the instruments in the drawing, where you place the tones and shadows, and then, of course, how you paint it. So I hope you've enjoyed this evening's lesson, and we'll catch up again next week for lesson number 5, where we'll carry on with this. Thanks very much. Bye.